Welcome to Gender, Race, and Class at Pace University. I'm your instructor, Dr. Ruth Abrams. So, this is a re recording of my first lecture. Um, I used to start the course with a lecture on theory, and I think that the first lecture of the course should start with more examples and fewer theories. So I know that sometimes I like to move the lectures around, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to leave this one at the beginning because it's about birth, right? So I'm calling it Starting at Birth. Gender, Race, and Class Starting at Birth. So I'm going to have to talk about theory eventually, probably in the second lecture. But in the first lecture, I wanted to pick something that would show you how socially constructed identities like gender, race, and class have a real impact on people's lives. That they're not just um, representation. I also wanted a topic that could show the ways that people socially construct identity. So I'm starting with what happens to people when they're born. And as usual, I'm going to focus mainly on our life today in the United States, though I'm also going to try to pull in some information about how things work in other countries and also a little bit of history. So you'll learn about me that I love history and I'm interested in other countries, but I know that really those are provide a context for what is happening here and now. So I do have to cover one piece of theory in this lecture, which is the idea that gender, race, and class are socially constructed. So, this is a really big idea of this course that gender, race, and class, and many other parts of our experience and identity that we think of as natural, are socially constructed. So, what does that mean? We grow up and live in a social world as much as a natural one. As a result, we come to see some social facts as natural. We don't think, for example, that water naturally comes out of the tap or that houses grow from wild house seeds, but we do think that many parts of our social identity are somehow natural to the way our bodies are, they're inborn in our bodies. We believe that certain physical differences are significant, even differences as small and casual as a hairstyle. The thing is, our gender, our race, and our socioeconomic class are just as built by other people as houses or plumbing. They are made up of how other people treat us, right? Now, obviously, they're also made up of how we treat other people because you too could participate in building a house. But I'm saying that, when you're born into the world, gender, race, and class already exist. They seem to be natural, but they're actually made up of how other people are treating us. So they are built on power relationships, and that's a really significant part of what we're going to be talking about. The purpose of the course is to teach you about the social construction of gender, race, and class through the actual institutions of your society, right? Gender, race, and class are based on or reinforce power relationships. Who is the boss of whom? Who decides how we treat people? We face a problem in studying our own society. Actually, several problems. The first is that it's our society, so it seems normal to us. It feels natural. It's hard to look at the things that make people seem very different from each other and realize that all of those differences are really the result of what people do, not of what people are. It's also hard because when we examine society, we're criticizing something that we're doing and making too. Like I said, you could be participating in building the house. Students often feel personally blamed or criticized for these inequalities that we discover as we pick apart the power relations that create gender, race, and class. The reason I think that it's good to talk about birth is that most people share a sense that babies are not to blame for where and how they're born. Most of us are familiar with the procedures our culture has that construct our identities at birth, but we haven't really thought about them in that way. And this is a great opportunity to think about those things without feeling shame and blame and guilt and this and that and the other thing. So let's talk about quantitative evidence. You see, I have that at the top of the slide, quantitative evidence, evidence that you can count. And specifically, I want to talk about demography and life expectancy. When you are born, demographers, who are people who study population, have an idea of how long you're going to live. And this idea is called life expectancy. Life expectancy is a calculation based on data. It's not the data itself, right? Because we don't know for sure how long you're going to live when you're born because you were just born, right? We have to figure out, how do you get the data? Governments around the world typically collect data about the life and death of the people in their countries. In the United States, the National Vital Statistics System is run by the National Center for Health Statistics in the Centers for Disease Control. They coordinate with state and local health departments, which keep track of local births and deaths. Births, you can probably guess, are tracked through birth certificates. Hospitals and mortuaries also help track deaths using death certificates. We know why people die. Well, we have a good guess about why people die because these institutions use codes called the International Classification of Disease Codes. If you're a nursing student at Pace, you have probably heard of ICD codes. And these are used to help us have a standard way of tracking what people die of. The United States has been tracking birth and death data since around 1880. Every person's birth certificate records their gender, their race, and often they collect data about their socioeconomic class. I hope you are now saying, wait, how do they record your class? We do not have official classes in the United States. We don't have a nobility. There's no, untouchable caste like in India. What is on the birth certificate to tell people what your class is? The age of your parents is recorded, their occupations usually, and sometimes their educational status. They're all class markers. A class marker, this is something they use, a term from sociology. A class marker is something that tells people your socioeconomic class. Let's say that class is a way of talking about how society treats people based on how they or their families make a living. I'm going to say this again when we get to the lecture on class. So when I say how society treats you, I mean, how easily can you meet your needs? How much money do you get from your job or from property ownership? How, can you get food? Can you get water? And secondly, how nicely do people treat you? In this class, we sometimes call how nicely do people treat you privilege. On your birth certificate and on your death certificate, there's information about those three big categories. Gender for sure, race, and class. How much information varies from state to state and also by era over time. People have collected more or less data according to what they thought at the time was important. Gender, race, and class affect life expectancy. We learned that demographers calculate life expectancy by figuring out how long people your age from your demographic group typically live. We learned this from the video that I assigned you that was the best thing I could find online to explain this even for myself, because I'm not a demographer and I really wanted to know, how do they do this? Let's put it another way. At every age, you have a risk of death. And demographers have data about how frequently people your age die of various things. So they want to figure out your risk of death at various ages. In 2015, which is the last year for which I could find data, a person born in the United States had a life expectancy of 78.8 years. If the person was male, that life expectancy was a little lower, 76.3 years. And if the person was female, that life expectancy was higher, 81.2 years. For reasons that no one can satisfactorily explain, women in every society live longer. If you were a black newborn baby boy in 2015, your life expectancy was 72.2 years. And if you were a black baby girl, your life expectancy was 78.5 years. If you were Hispanic or Latinx and you were a baby in 2015, you were in a little bit of a better situation. Latino baby boys have a 2.6 longer life expectancy than white baby boys, and a 7.6 year longer life expectancy than black baby boys. Latina baby girls also live longer than both white baby girls, 2.6 years, and black baby girls, 5.7 years. Now, when I say they live longer, remember, this is a calculation of the risk of death at various ages. The chart also listed out people's life expectancies at age 65 and 75. You're much more likely to live longer if you make it to be elderly. Why? A lot of the risks differ in infancy, childhood, and youth. Black infants are more likely to be born prematurely and have a higher rate of infant mortality than white infants. They are more likely to lose their mothers in childbirth than white infants. Hispanic and Latinx babies are more likely to breastfeed than either black or white babies. We know that babies who nurse rather than taking formula in the first year of life have better survival rates for just about everything. Poverty and racism are both also big factors for how long people live once they have survived infancy and childhood. The U.S. infant mortality rates are higher compared to other countries. Let's talk about the impact of racism on these statistics and about how we hear them. The first thing to say is black infant and maternal mortality is a crisis in the U.S. The same statistics that have disturbed me since I started writing this in 2012 have been bothering other people too. Obviously, I don't do original research in this area. I had to be reading news stories and academic articles and statistics somewhere, and other people have been reading them too, and they're upset by them also. That makes me feel better because I felt when I started writing this course like a voice crying in the wilderness. You learned from the readings I assigned that African Americans, Native Americans, and Alaskan Natives are all 3 times as likely as white people to die from pregnancy-related causes. In terms of infant mortality, the U.S. as a whole is in big trouble. Our infant mortality rate is 5.8 deaths per 1,000 live births. Now, usually, and this is true of almost all the other countries, richer countries have better outcomes than poorer ones, but the United States is a big exception. Again, African American and Native American babies are at the highest risk, higher than white, Hispanic, or Asian American babies. The mortality rate for Black Americans, infant mortality rate, is 11.4 per 1,000. For Native Americans and Alaskan Natives, 9.4 per 1,000, and for Native Hawaiians, 7.4 per 1,000 live births. When we break out the statistics, we run into a familiar, to me now, set of problems. Listen, if we don't break out the statistics by these racial categories, we will fail to identify racism that is happening in our provision of prenatal and medical care. Right? People are discriminating somehow, and we have to figure out how. So we have to break this out. But when we do break these out, white people get, really complacent. They make all kinds of excuses to ignore the problem because they think it's not going to affect them. So first of all, number one, it will affect white people as a group if this is happening to other people in the country, even if other minorities are at a higher risk, because the U.S. white, if you break out only the white infant mortality and maternal mortality rates, we still have a higher rate per 1,000 than all of the European countries, Australia, and even like Cuba and even some poor countries like Estonia, we just not in as good shape. And racism is definitely a large part of the explanation of why our infant and maternal mortality rates is so high. But some of that is we don't provide social programs that would also help people who are at lower risk than people of color, but higher risk than they should be, considering that we're so rich. So this is like a thing that we have, a problem that we have with racism in general, that white people are willing to accept worse outcomes for themselves because they think that if racism is a factor, that they will not be involved and that they will not be harmed. So this graph I have up here is from Time Magazine in January 2018, so it's relatively recent. And it compares the US with 35 other developed countries in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. About 20% of US children live in poverty. And poverty is the single biggest determinant of life expectancy. If you're poor, you're going to have a worse life expectancy. And if you're rich, you will have a better life expectancy. So we have a higher rate of child mortality in general. So race and class really affect whether you live or die, even, and more, I would say especially, as a child. So let's talk about the mechanical reasons why the United States is doing such a bad job of keeping our babies and mothers alive. The first thing is we have no universal health care. Every other industrialized country has covered all of their citizens with some kind of health insurance to ensure that everybody is going to get basic health care, and the United States has not. And this is even true after a recent health care reform. We have this health care reform called the Affordable Care Act, which I see that the current presidential administration is doing everything to dismantle. But even before it was being attacked, we still didn't have 100% health insurance. Now, it definitely improved things because before the ACA, we were at something like 16% uninsured. 44 million people were uninsured. It actually was a little higher in 2010. I went to look this up, but they didn't count that so much because there was high unemployment in 2010, and a lot of people in the US get their health insurance from employers. But when employment numbers started to bounce back, we still had 44 million people without insurance. So the ACA has had a really positive impact because now we're down to something like 9.1% of Americans without health insurance. But our health insurance system is really patchy, and it can sometimes result in people not having medical care. 9.1% of such a big country is a lot of people without health care. Now, the other thing is our medical care is more expensive in the United States than in any other country. And this may be because of the lack of universal health insurance. It may be because we don't subsidize medical education. Other countries, pay, if they have a gifted student, they make sure they can become a doctor. Our doctors go into debt. It's because the government doesn't regulate the price of medicine. We don't like price controls, but other countries do. And so they don't allow drug companies to inflate the price of drugs, or for doctors to inflate the price of practice. But also, like, the doctors themselves, besides having student loans to pay off, as is frequently true, and also really complicated insurance they have to hire people to deal with, which is actually like a specialty. In addition, our doctors have to pay for their own malpractice insurance, and in some other countries they don't. I haven't surveyed every country, but it turns out in Britain, which of course you think a lot about Britain if you're in the US, the NHS covers all the malpractice insurance. So no individual doctor has to pay out of their gross income for insurance. It's not an expense for them, so they don't have to jack up the prices of healthcare for that. So all of this adds up to some moms do not get prenatal care, and a lack of prenatal care can mean that preventable problems are not caught. So that's important. Not all prenatal care in the US is evidence-based. That's not only in the US. People have a lot of superstitions about labor and delivery, and they implement them even if they've gone to medical school. Um, but this means that doctors and nurses will sometimes keep doing practices that have been shown to be harmful. Still, even saying that, it's still better to get prenatal care than not to get prenatal care. No maternity insurance. We don't have paid family leave. We only got a law ensuring that new moms couldn't be fired in the 1990s. Um, Nearly every, well, so that's not exactly right. That new moms could take uh, a leave, family medical leave. Nearly every other country has paid maternity leave. I think the only one that I can remember besides the U.S. that doesn't is Papua New Guinea. So like a couple of little tiny countries with no money have no maternity leave, and us. That's it. So this reduces our breastfeeding rates. This reduces infant attachment. It means that parents have to pay for daycare. So it's not good for us for baby's health and for mom's health. Health insurance only covers a short hospital stay after birth. You can stay for 3 days. Home visits from nurses are not included in insurance. So moms go home. There's nobody checking up on you for 6 weeks. If moms are bleeding or have a heart condition that wasn't caught in those first 3 days, there may not be someone knowledgeable who observes it to treat it, and you can die. And if you have a population of people who are more likely to have bleeding or heart risks after birth, as are African Americans, they're at greater risk from this policy. This is one of several ways that race can put people at higher risk after childbirth. Also, our cesarean section rates, I have C-section rates here, are too high, which means some births are done surgically for no reason, which is risky for maternal health. This was a scandal for a while, and people were like criticizing moms because they'd had C-sections. But the truth is that your doctor has to put it out there as something that you can have or should have. Our hospitals have also. I have to say here, I know that students are going to get mad at me because this has happened before. Some cesarean sections are necessary. And if you are in a high risk pregnancy, cesarean section can be necessary. I'm saying that if there are necessary cesarean sections, there are some that are unnecessary. A very high percentage of surgical births in the US. Our hospitals have a metric for measuring newborn health, but not for monitoring moms. Now that's something that's changing, so it's possible that won't be true pretty soon. Now, all of the policy decisions that we have made as a society seem to be unrelated to gender, race, and class because they just seem to be like, how we happen to do things. But when we pull them apart, we can see that sexism, racism, and class underpin them all. I don't really like to say classism when I want to say treating poor people like crap because that's what class really means. I've always suspected that our society is based on a hatred of infants and children, which is very distressing. Now more than ever, I really think that's true. So let's talk a little bit about the role of race in maternal mortality and life expectancy. I have no idea why I have this image here, but I'm just going to keep talking over it because it's interesting. Black women in the United States are at higher risk for preterm labor and low birth weight infants, even controlling for factors like education and socioeconomic status. African American mothers with a college degree have worse birth outcomes than white mothers who never finished high school, even though in general, education is a predictor of good birth outcomes. Researchers are also seeing that African American women are more likely to die during or immediately after childbirth, as are women in the US generally in comparison to other industrialized countries. I said this in the other slide. Black women in childbirth are at risk for more than one reason. So this idea of things happening for more than one reason, it comes up a lot in this course. It's often, we talk about this as intersectionality. The first reason, though, is extensive epidemiological research has shown racism stresses out people's bodies and makes African Americans more likely to develop high blood pressure than other populations in the US and than other black folks in Africa and in the African diaspora. So that's why I assigned you a short piece arguing that it's racism and not race that puts these moms and babies at risk of death. Another reason is economic. About 27% of African Americans earn below the poverty line. And as I've said, healthcare coverage is not universal and is really expensive. Economic factors can also explain why other low income people have bad birth outcomes. Yet that high percentage of people in poverty still puts 2/3 of black Americans above the poverty line. Discrimination, even against middle and high income black patients, has to be taken into account. In the past, I've had students who really did not want to attribute bad birth outcomes to racism. Basically, they would like the problem to be either a lack of prenatal care because of poverty, which we have discussed and is important, but that means that it has to be a problem of class rather than race, or the fault of the mothers themselves. Either a genetic flaw, which, as I've tried to address in the readings, most researchers think it is not, or a flaw in the mother's own behavior. This is because I think, as a society, we're reluctant to say that doctors and nurses can show racial bias in healthcare. It goes against our ideas about how education will make you a better person, right? Yet we know that black moms fall into three categories that healthcare workers do not like to believe, do not like to credit. They're black, they're women, usually, and they're patients. So, what do we know about this? How do we know anything about this? We can do studies of how healthcare workers make decisions. So, people have done several studies already of how healthcare workers administer pain relief. And it shows that healthcare workers are less likely to believe what women say about their pain. They're less likely to believe what people of color say about their bodies or to administer pain medication, even for injuries that they know are painful, to people of color. So I want to highlight this. The way that we know this is not by asking people of color, are you discriminated against? The way we find this out is we conduct psychological and sociological studies of the healthcare workers, no matter what their race is, right? Doctors and nurses. So this parenthetical comment is brought to you by the committee for pointing out how we can find out things, an important aspect of the class. When the tennis star Serena Williams wrote about her birth experience, she explained that if she had not insisted that she be checked for a blood clot in her leg, she would have died immediately after giving birth. Now, this slide makes all the sense. It is the one I intended to have here. It has a picture of her on the cover of Vogue with her daughter as a little baby, and a quote from the Vogue article where they explain what happened. Williams is a professional athlete who had blood clots before she became pregnant. It was her job to know her own body. But her labor and delivery nurse initially dismissed what she said. Right? And she thought that that the pain medicine was making her say things that were silly. So she had to be persistent and courageous. And I'm sure that to a lot of the people who were there, it looked like a celebrity being bratty. But if she had not done so, she would have died. The adversarial and non evidence based practices that many people giving birth in the U.S. encounter are compounded for black women by racism in the medical system. Overlapping social forces that affect women and African American patients affect black women in particular when they go into labor. This idea that I'm talking about, overlapping social forces, multiple reasons that something might happen, is called intersectionality. We're going to learn more about this important idea next week, and you will be able to understand what I'm talking about because we talked about Serena Williams, right? Where doctors and nurses don't believe laboring mothers or do what they want in general, this is what I mean by adversarial practices, where the mother asks for something and the healthcare person's first response is, no, we're not going to do what you ask, right? Black women are at higher risk because they are also Black patients. Get me? One way to think about intersectionality is that some people are in more than one group at risk for the same kind of discrimination, so they are at greater risk for that kind of discrimination. It also covers the idea that a person is in two groups that suffer different kinds of discrimination, so they're at greater risk for discrimination in general, but it could look differently. As we learned from the articles I assigned, there are a lot of things that we could be doing as a society together to stop Black moms from dying during and after giving birth. One thing that looks promising is training doulas. Doulas are professional birth companions who go through the labor and delivery process with women, and we could just have them do, we can train them to go with Black moms. And there's some Black women's organizations that have developed this as a practice, just getting Black doulas to help Black mothers. Another idea that has already been tested in California is to have hospitals take on lowering maternal mortality as something that they're going to measure. Because you measure what you value. This is something we're going to learn a lot about in this course. In that big state of California, public health officials decided to train hospital staff about what to do in cases of postpartum bleeding. They put together crash carts with what the staff needs to stop bleeding, right? To measure and stop bleeding. They were able to bring down bleeding deaths by 20% in 2 years, right? They could be taking on every cause of death, but there was one that they could see that they could fix if they could do this simple fix, and it really did work. Socially constructed identities start at birth. So let's talk about gender. When the baby comes out of the womb, what is the first thing people say? It's a boy or it's a girl. Well, that used to be the first thing people said if the baby was breathing and healthy. But today, many parents choose to find out the sex of their baby in the womb with an ultrasound. In some parts of China and India, parents were choosing sex-selective abortion because there were limits on the number of children that government or their society wants them to have. In the United States and now in some other countries, parents will have a gender reveal party. We don't like abortion in the United States, so certainly no one would admit to sex-selective abortion, but instead they would use the ultrasound, find out the gender of the baby, the sex of the embryo, and tell their family the sex of the fetus that they found out through the ultrasound. I say that gender reveal is a misnomer because I understand gender is more complicated than seeing a little penis on your gestating tiny being. You can see I have a picture to show what I'm talking about. For centuries, the big moment of humanization of the infant was the assignment of gender at birth based on the primary sex characteristics of the baby. By primary, I mean they're the ones you see first. Not that they're more important than secondary sex characteristics like breasts or mustaches that appear in puberty, right? I feel like I have to explain this because at least twice people were like, primary? You mean the genitals are more important than breasts? But they're not. But even this might be more complicated than we used to think. The images I've chosen here are a stork on the left, because there was this myth that storks brought babies, a gender reveal cake on the top right, and an ultrasound image of a fetus someone marked up with gender information. When I was born, people did send out birth announcements with images of storks, but we did not have this creepy thing called a gender reveal cake. It's not the cake that's creepy, okay? What is the relationship between physical sex and gender? Wait, I need a record scratch here because we have to back up. What is the relationship between the visible primary sex characteristics at birth and a person's sex, not gender? Since the 1990s, we've begun to rethink both of these things. We know now that something like 1% of people are intersex. I've actually seen higher percentages lately because there are more intersex conditions being counted in this category. The term intersex covers the minority of people who are born with differences from the usual male female body binary. So, about 1 in 100 people differ in some way from the most usual hormonal, chromosomal, or genital sex configurations. About 1 or 2 in 1,000 have surgery to correct issues with their genitals. So I have to tell you, I knew about intersex people before 2012, but I went to do a Google to to talk about this group. I had no idea how prevalent intersex conditions were until then. So one of the books I picked up, Hannah Blank's book called Straight: The Surprisingly Short History of Heterosexuality, explains that she wrote the book in part because she had at the time, and I maybe still, a partner with Klinefelter syndrome, a chromosomal anomaly. I think sometimes people say chromosomal abnormality, but I don't like to use the word abnormal as much as they used to, because a thing that always happens, even if it only happens to a really small minority of people, is not abnormal. It's normal for there to be intersex people. It's just uncommon. And in general, things can be uncommon and not abnormal. So let's talk about Klinefelter syndrome. This is Most women have two X chromosomes, and most men have an X and a Y chromosome. But Hannah Blank's partner has this Klinefelter syndrome, and that is an XXY chromosomal configuration. He has a functioning penis. He's always used he, him pronouns. He doesn't have any health problems from this, except for infertility, which is sad, um, unless you don't want to have children. And from her book, it sounds like he's been a really good long term partner. Probably about 500,000 people have this syndrome. And there are some other ones that are less common, like a triple XXX or XYY. But other intersex conditions can be detected at birth. Some babies are born with different genitals. They have a urethra on the underside of the penis, or a micropenis, or a really big clitoris, an inability to use testosterone that makes the body mostly female but with testicles, and so on. The novel Middlesex by Jeffrey Eugenides described a fictional character with a real intersex condition called androgen insensitivity syndrome. The character believes she is a girl until she hits puberty, when she gets a whole new set of genitals and begins, without even thinking about it, living as a boy. Some people who like the gender they were assigned at birth might choose, if they find out they have this, to remove the new genitals. So we think of cisgender people as the ones who do not need gender confirmation surgery, but here's a rare case where there's an intersex person who is not transgender, who is cisgender, because she likes the gender she was assigned at birth. Likes is the wrong word. She is the gender she was assigned at birth. And she suddenly, at puberty, got surprise genitals, right? Because that's what happens when you have an androgen insensitivity syndrome. And she had them removed. I learned about a person who had this recently because there was a news article about a doctor who performed this surgery for a teenager. Intersex adults have begun talking about their conditions and identifying as a single group. And the main reason that they've come out and started to unify this way is to advocate for new approaches about how to treat babies who have intersex conditions. Since the 1960s or so, parents and doctors have decided to deal with genital differences at birth by performing surgery on infants or children to confirm them in just one gender. They were for a long time just choosing the gender that seemed the easiest to go with, considering the physical configuration. And they did it because they could. They did it because they could. Because, for years, people were born with these conditions where they had more than one kind of genitals, and they just had to live with that. But doctors were like, we can reform genitals, and this is going to be great because this person won't have to be weird, won't have to be different. But when intersex people grew into adulthood, they said they wanted to be left unmodified. They didn't necessarily want people to make decisions for them when they were babies. Intersex adults have suggested and are campaigning to have parents wait not to agree to surgery when somebody is an infant or a child. It's better to have unusual genitals than it is to have someone make a decision about something so important to the child before the child has a chance to say something. And I have to tell you, because of my age, when I first read about this, I thought that sounded really hard for parents. I thought, oh, wow, that must be so difficult to decide to wait and to have to answer your child's questions about why they have different genitals than everyone else. But all my students, when I first started talking about this, disagreed with me. They couldn't even understand why parents and doctors dared to make this decision for infants and children. So I think that we've really changed as a society around this stuff. Let me try to explain a little bit of my thinking about this. Gender is a huge part of growing up, and it's difficult to be different in such a profound way. On the other hand, having two sets of surgeries on a sensitive and delicate part of the body isn't good for a child either. So, and also it's not good for people to have the experience of being raised feeling that something is wrong. I still think parents who have children who present as intersex at birth are dealing with some heavy parenting decisions about how to react and what to do. But, the important thing is for people to have autonomy. Anyway, you can think what you like about this. All right, so let's talk about gender theories and gender minorities and real lives. I want to talk about why so many people now accept the idea that the primary sex characteristics a person has at birth may not be the same as their gender. It's not only the increase in the visibility of trans people or even the more recent increase in the visibility of intersex people. We owe a lot to those people for taking the risk of being open about their experiences. This isn't only because it helps people who are parents figure out what to do or how to cope. What I see as remarkable about the gradual movement of trans people out of the closet is that it means trans people can stay in the lives of their families and communities. In the past, when people wanted to transition, and they would have to basically disappear, change their names, move away, and so on. Because if they didn't pass, they could be targets of violence. They did not come out. Coming out for trans people means staying in a way, staying in their families, staying in their jobs, and so on. So, I think a lot of people in my generation have been like, oh, what a pain in the butt this is. I have to learn new pronouns. I have to, deal with people changing their gender. But what they don't realize is that the other choice is for the person to ghost you, right? So this is really a lot better. This is also true, obviously, of people in minority sexualities, but that they've been on this a lot longer. Lesbian, gay, and bi or pansexual people are now kind of staying in their communities. Like when you come out and tell people who you are, you don't have to go somewhere else to be who you are. Greater visibility means more models for acceptance, more ways for people to stay in their families. So this idea that we now accept that gender is not dependent on primary sex characteristics, that sexuality and gender are distinct categories, come out of some deep philosophical disagreements that I would never have thought could come into people's lives in quite this way. People have come to talk about gender as something one is assigned at birth. When they say this, it's a way of acknowledging that gender is separate from sex. It also tells us that some people's sex is complicated. So I have to take note of this as well. All the people who give birth aren't women. I assigned you a podcast for really little kids because I really like the elegant way that the sex educator that they interviewed on the podcast talked about this. Some people who give birth have non binary gender identity, and even some trans men give birth. Here's a weird thing then: discrimination in reproductive health is always sexist, even when our notions of gender shift to include people who give birth who aren't women or who are gender nonconforming. One thing that has divided the feminist movement in recent years is the idea that transgender issues might distract people from reproductive health issues. But I don't think that's necessarily correct. I'm coming to think that all sexuality, reproductive, and gender issues in medical care are intertwined, that it's not possible to deal with reproductive issues without also dealing with gender. Gender is foundational to our thinking about people. And I'm going to talk more about Judith Butler, but I don't think I might assign you some Judith Butler, but maybe something very popular. But she was one of the people who talked about the moment when people become human is when we ask whether the baby is a boy or a girl. Obviously, she was writing before everybody. Well, maybe I'm wrong about that. Perhaps people become human in the womb when you start to gender them in the womb. Most of us are conditioned to believe that some characteristics are inherent to women based on our biology, and that others are socially determined. This gives people the option to both criticize women for not being feminine enough, because femininity is a set of voluntary behaviors that include dress and voice and hygiene and so on, and yet to also believe that womanliness is attached to primary and secondary sex characteristics. The question of which idea is truer has become politicized, and we'll talk about this more in the gender lecture. This is really interesting also when you're taking a course that's also about race and racism. Can you opt into or out of being a member of a racial minority? Also, some groups that were not racialized are now racialized. This comes up a lot. There's a conflict between the right of a group to self-define, the rights of individuals to self-define, and the wider society's ability to accept either right to self-definition. Sometimes they want to define you. This comes up a lot for students when I cover American, Indian, and Native American tribes here. Students want to know how people are included or not included in tribes. The majority culture, meaning white people, has made laws about how the minority culture should interact with its members. In the past, every racialized minority group that has been a target of U.S. policy has somehow been defined in U.S. law. For example, when racial segregation of African Americans was legal in the mid-20th century, there was a so-called one-drop rule that some states adopted to identify who counted as black. Any African ancestry was enough to trigger Jim Crow laws. This idea has persisted after the end of legal segregation. Another example is in the laws excluding first Chinese immigrants in 1882 and then immigrants from all of Asia in 1924. Social practices define racial groups. When it comes to gender, since the participation in consensus about who is in the group is so high, we can run into serious cognitive dissonance, as things people tell us are natural are challenged. I have found teaching this course that people have that cognitive dissonance about a lot of things: gender, race, class, and all the other categories associated with them, like disability and sexuality, which both seem to be important to think about in this course. In part, I think this is because the social construction of our identity is so automatic. We think defining people by certain characteristics is natural, but the definitions are not. I hope by putting some of these topics into the framework of the life cycle, I can show you how we as a society create these identities that we think are natural, with all the inequalities that accompany them. Okay, this was not perfect, but I think it will work. So there is a check-in for you to do related to this lecture, and I look forward to hearing from you about it.